September 14, 1945, a military transport ship dropped anchor off the coast of Queensland, Australia, carrying cargo that would challenge every cultural assumption both nations held about gender, honour, and humanity. Inside the vessel's hold sat 29 Japanese women, members of the Imperial Army's nursing corps, captured on islands throughout the Pacific as Japan collapsed. They were terrified, traumatized, and completely unprepared for what they were about to encounter. As landing craft ferried them to shore and trucks carried them toward Cowra internment camp's newly established women's section, the prisoners braced themselves for the fate they had been promised awaited captured Japanese women. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become a story told and retold for generations. A moment of unprecedented respect that would ultimately transform both prisoners and guards alike. Before we discover what made these women say no man had ever treated them with such dignity, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 26-year-old Yuki Tanaka sat rigid in the back of the truck, her hands folded in her lap in the precise manner she had been taught since childhood. She had served as a military nurse on Okinawa, tending to wounded soldiers while believing absolutely in the imperial propaganda that portrayed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, and that Western men, particularly Australians, were barbaric brutes who would brutalize captured Japanese women before killing them. She had been told that Australian soldiers were especially savage. Hardened by years of brutal Pacific combat and harboring particular hatred for Japanese after the atrocities committed by Japanese forces, she had been told to take her own life rather than fall into enemy hands, that anything was preferable to the shame and suffering that awaited her. As the truck approached the camp gates, Yuki closed her eyes and tried to find the courage to face what she believed would be her final degradation. What she experienced instead would shatter every certainty she had ever held about honor, masculinity, and what it meant to be treated as a human being. The truck stopped at the processing area, and guards began directing the women toward the intake facility. Yuki expected rough handling, verbal abuse, perhaps physical violence. Instead, an Australian sergeant, a man in his 30s with sun-weathered skin and the name Murphy stenciled on his uniform, stepped forward and addressed them through a Japanese-Australian interpreter. "Ladies," he said, the word itself shocking in its implications of respect. "You're prisoners of war, which means you're under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity and given proper facilities. We'll process you now for medical screening and assignment to quarters." The interpreter, a second-generation Japanese-Australian woman named Keiko Yamada, translated the sergeant's words with visible emotion. The concept that they would be called ladies, that they would be given protection, that dignity would be part of their treatment, contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught. Yuki exchanged glances with 23-year-old Hana Sato beside her, seeing her own confusion reflected. This wasn't the behavior of barbarians. This wasn't what you said to people you planned to abuse. But it was what happened during the processing that would become the defining moment of their captivity. As the women were directed into separate screening areas for medical examination, Yuki noticed that all the medical staff examining them were female. Australian Army nurses conducted the examinations with professional efficiency and surprising gentleness. There were no male guards in the examination rooms, no leering soldiers, no violation of the privacy that Japanese culture held sacred. When Yuki's turn came, the nurse examining her injuries from the battle for Okinawa explained each procedure before performing it, asked permission before touching her, and treated her with a level of respect Yuki had rarely experienced even from Japanese medical personnel. "I need to check your shoulder wound," the nurse said through Keiko. "May I?" The question itself was revolutionary, asking permission, treating her autonomy as something that mattered even though she was a prisoner, even though she was the enemy. Yuki nodded, unable to speak, and submitted to an examination that was thorough, professional, and completely devoid of the humiliation she had been prepared to endure. When it was done, the nurse made notes on her chart and said, "You'll need some follow-up care for that. We'll get you scheduled. Is there anything else you need? Any pain we should address?" Around her, other women were having similar experiences. Hana emerged from her examination looking dazed, whispering to Yuki in Japanese, "They treated me like a patient, not a prisoner. Like I was a person." 31-year-old Lieutenant Michiko Watanabe, the ranking officer among the prisoners, watched these interactions with visible disbelief. She had been in the Imperial Army for 8 years, had internalized its rigid hierarchies and its teachings about Western barbarism. Nothing in her training had prepared her for Australian soldiers who respected female prisoners' dignity and privacy. The morning of September 15th brought the women their first full day in the camp, and with it more opportunities to observe the incomprehensible respect their captors showed them. Breakfast was served in a mess hall that had been designated for female prisoners only, with female staff serving the food and only female guards present. The food itself was basic but adequate, and crucially, the women were allowed to eat without male guards watching them, a consideration for Japanese cultural norms about modesty that none of them had expected. After breakfast, Sergeant Murphy addressed them through Keiko, explaining the camp rules and daily routine. His manner was formal, professional, treating them as military personnel rather than as criminals or objects of contempt. "You'll have work assignments, mostly in the camp gardens and laundry facilities. You'll be paid nominal wages for your labour as required by international law. You'll have regular medical care and recreation time. You'll be allowed to write letters home once postal channels are established with occupied Japan." Yuki listened to these words with growing confusion. Wages, medical care, letters home. These were considerations given to people whose welfare mattered. She raised her hand, a gesture she would never have dared make with a Japanese superior officer, and Murphy nodded at her. "Yes?" Through Keiko, Yuki asked the question that had been burning in her mind since arrival. "Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemies. Japanese soldiers did terrible things to Australian prisoners. Why show us respect we don't deserve?" Murphy's expression grew somber. "Because," he said slowly, "how we treat you says more about us than it does about you. What Japanese forces did to our boys was barbaric. We could respond with barbarism. Or we could prove we're better than that. We chose to be better." He paused, then added, "And you're not soldiers who committed atrocities. You're nurses who helped wounded men. There's a difference." The words struck Yuki with unexpected force. The Australians were making moral distinctions, recognizing that not all Japanese personnel were equally culpable, treating them according to what they had done, rather than simply punishing them for being Japanese. The concept was so foreign to the rigid collective responsibility she had been raised with that she struggled to process it. The breakthrough came on September the 20th, during an afternoon when several of the women were assigned to work in the camp's vegetable garden alongside Australian staff. Yuki found herself working near a young corporal, probably 24 years old, who introduced himself through gestures and simple words as Tom. He had clearly been briefed on Japanese cultural norms because he maintained respectful distance, never touched her without warning, and treated her with a formality that acknowledged her discomfort with casual interaction. As they worked, Keiko happened by and facilitated conversation. Tom asked Yuki about her nursing experience, showing genuine interest in her professional background. "How long were you a nurse?" he asked. "Did you train in Japan before the war?" The questions treated her as a person with a history and skills, not just as a captured enemy. Yuki found herself answering hesitantly at first, then with growing comfort as Tom's interest proved sincere. "I trained in Tokyo," she said through Keiko. 3 years before the war. I wanted to help people. To heal." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good calling. Noble work. Healing people." He paused, then said something that would change everything. My sister's a nurse back in Melbourne. She'd say you're a colleague, not an enemy. That nurses are supposed to be neutral, helping anyone who's hurt, regardless of what side they're on. The statement hung in the air between them. The idea that professional identity could transcend national loyalty, that healing could be a bond stronger than enmity, challenged fundamental assumptions Yuki had held her entire life. In Japan, she had been taught that individual identity was subsumed into collective national identity, that there was no self separate from service to the emperor. But Tom was suggesting that being a nurse was an identity that existed beyond nationality. A commitment to human welfare that made her something other than simply Japanese enemy. September 28, 1945, brought an event that would crystallize the Japanese women's transformation in a way that daily respectful treatment alone could not. Mail arrived from Japan, the first communication the prisoners had received from home since their capture. 23 of the 29 women received letters from family members. The contents revealed truths about Japan's situation that propaganda had hidden from them. Truths made more painful by the contrast with how they were being treated by the supposed barbarians. Keiko Yamada arranged for the letters to be distributed in private, with medical staff nearby in case the news proved traumatic. As Yuki opened her letter from her mother, her hands trembled. The words were written in the indirect, formal style Japanese women used to communicate painful truths without stating them explicitly. Her father was dead, killed in the firebombing of Tokyo. Their home was destroyed. Her younger brother was missing, presumably killed in the final desperate defense of the home islands. Her mother was living in a refugee shelter, surviving on minimal rations, waiting for news about whether Japan would even continue to exist as a nation. The letter ended with words that cut Yuki to her core. If you are alive, Yuki-chan, then you are blessed. Do not feel shame for surviving. There is no honor in needless death. Your father said so before the fire took him. Live. That is what matters now. Live and come home when you can. Yuki lowered the letter, tears streaming down her face. Her father, a man who had believed in the imperial cause, had rejected the propaganda about honorable death in his final moments. He had chosen life, had wanted his daughter to choose life. Around her, other women were experiencing similar revelations as they learned of destroyed cities, dead family members, and a Japan so devastated that survival itself was the only victory left. Hana was sobbing openly, having learned her entire family was gone. Michiko sat in stony silence, her letter revealing that her husband had been executed for suggesting surrender before the atomic bombs made it inevitable. An Australian nurse named Sarah Mitchell moved through the room, offering tissues and quiet comfort. She found Yuki sitting on her bunk, clutching the letter and trying not to scream. Sarah sat down beside her, not touching but present, offering the comfort of simple human proximity. "Family?" she asked gently. Yuki nodded, unable to speak. Sarah's expression showed deep sympathy. "I'm so sorry. War is cruel to families." She paused, then added softly, "But you're alive. That matters. That's not nothing." The words echoed her mother's, this Australian nurse and her Japanese mother somehow arriving at the same truth across enemy lines. Survival mattered. Life mattered. Not honor in death, but the courage to live with loss and keep going. Yuki looked at Sarah through her tears. "Why are you kind to me?" she asked in halting English she had been learning. "Japanese soldiers hurt Australian prisoners. I know this. Why show kindness to enemies?" Sarah's expression grew sad but determined. "Because someone has to stop the cycle. If we hurt you because your people hurt ours, then your people hurt the next group because we hurt you. It never ends. Someone has to choose to be better. We're trying to be better." She met Yuki's eyes directly. "You're a nurse. You understand. Sometimes you have to treat infected wounds even when it hurts. Sometimes you have to cut out poison even when the patient doesn't understand. We're cutting out the poison of revenge. Treating you with dignity is part of the cure. The weeks following the letters from home were marked by a profound shift in the camp's atmosphere. The Japanese women began engaging with their situation more actively, rather than simply enduring it. They asked questions about Australian culture, about democracy, about how men and women interacted in a society so different from their own. They wanted to understand the people who treated them with respect they had never experienced from men in their own culture. Yuki found herself increasingly drawn to conversations with Keiko Yamada, who had become a bridge between two worlds. One afternoon in early October, Yuki asked the question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. "Keiko-san, you are Japanese but also Australian. How do you exist as both? In Japan, we are taught to be only one thing, only Japanese. How do you choose?" Keiko smiled sadly. "I don't choose. I am both. My parents taught me Japanese culture, language, respect for ancestors. Australia gave me education, freedom, the right to speak my mind. I don't have to give up one to be the other." She looked at Yuki directly. "You've been taught that being Japanese means total submission to authority. That questioning is disloyalty, that women exist only to serve men and the nation. But that's not the only way to be Japanese. That's just the way militarists wanted you to be, so you'd be easier to control." The words were revolutionary. The idea that Japanese identity could exist separate from militarism, that she could question authority and still honor her ancestors, that being a woman didn't mean accepting subjugation, all of it challenged the foundation of everything Yuki had been taught. "The Australian men here," she said slowly, "they treat us with respect. Not like Japanese men, not like we are less. Why?" Keiko's expression showed both understanding and a touch of sadness. "Because Australian culture teaches that women are people first, not just roles. Not perfect, they still have problems, but better than what you knew. Sergeant Murphy treats you with respect because he was raised to believe women deserve respect. It's not special treatment, it's just how he thinks men should behave." She paused. "That's probably why you said no man has ever treated you this way. Because no man in Japan was taught to see you as fully human, as an equal who deserves dignity." October 17th, 1945, brought news that would force the women to confront complex truths about the war and their role in it. Allied forces investigating Japanese war crimes had begun documenting atrocities committed throughout the Pacific, including brutality toward prisoners, civilians, and subject populations. Australian authorities decided that Japanese POWs should see evidence of what had been done in their nation's name, believing that understanding the full truth was necessary for genuine transformation. Sergeant Murphy arranged for a private screening in the camp's education room. Understanding the material would be difficult, but believing the women deserved to face reality. The Japanese prisoners gathered, uncertain about what they were about to see. Murphy stood before them, his expression grave. "What you're about to see is photographs and testimony about atrocities committed by Japanese military forces. Some of these happened to Australian soldiers. Some happened to civilians in occupied territories. This is difficult, but you need to know what was done in your nation's name." The images appeared on the screen, projected one after another. Photographs of the Bataan Death March. Testimony from Australian POWs about conditions in Japanese camps. Evidence of massacres in China, Korea, the Philippines, the systematic brutality that had characterized Japanese military policy toward conquered peoples. The room filled with sounds of gasping, crying, and shocked silence. Yuki stared at the images with growing horror, each one a hammer blow to any remaining illusions about the righteousness of Japan's cause. Hana was bent over, her body shaking with sobs. Michiko sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face, her military bearing completely shattered. When the presentation finally ended, nobody moved. They sat in various stages of emotional collapse, trying to process the impossible truth that their nation had committed horrors while claiming to be liberating Asia from Western imperialism. Sergeant Murphy spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. I'm not showing you this to make you feel guilty for things you didn't do. You were nurses. You helped people. But you need to understand why Australians have every reason to hate Japanese prisoners. We could have treated you the way your military treated our men. We chose not to. That choice is what separates us. And I hope it's a choice you'll remember and carry forward. Yuki raised her hand, her voice barely audible. How do we live with this knowledge? How do we honor our country knowing what was done? Murphy's expression showed both sympathy and steel. By acknowledging it, by refusing to pretend it didn't happen, by choosing to be different going forward. You can't undo the past, but you can refuse to defend it. You can be witnesses to the truth. That's your responsibility now. That night, the women's barracks were filled with quiet crying and whispered conversations that lasted until dawn. They held each other, trying to process the collision of truths. That their country had committed atrocities, and that their enemies had shown them mercy. That Japanese propaganda had been lies, and that Australian respect had been genuine. That everything they believed about honor and masculinity and their place in the world had been constructed to serve a regime that had betrayed them completely. The weeks following the atrocity evidence were the darkest period in the camp's history. The Japanese women moved through their routines mechanically, their visible injuries healing while their psychological wounds deepened. Some stopped eating properly, unable to swallow while knowing what had been done to starving prisoners in Japanese camps. Others barely spoke, lost in private reconciliation with unbearable knowledge. Sergeant Murphy was genuinely concerned about their mental health, recognizing that the trauma would have lasting effects. It was Michiko Watanabe, the ranking lieutenant, who finally proposed a way forward. On November the 3rd, she approached Murphy with a request that surprised him. "Sergeant," she said in improving English, "we want to work, more work. We want to help Australian veterans who were in Japanese camps. If they will allow, we want to care for them, to try to show we are not what our military was." Murphy was taken aback by the request. The idea of Japanese women caring for Australian men who had survived Japanese brutality was fraught with psychological complexity. But he brought it to the camp commander, who consulted with medical officers. Surprisingly, several Australian veterans recovering from their imprisonment actually supported the idea, saying it might help both groups heal. A limited program was approved, with careful screening and supervision. 8 Japanese nurses, including Yuki, Hana, and Michiko, began working in the camp's hospital wing, where former POWs were recovering from the effects of their captivity. The work was emotionally brutal. They cared for men with permanent injuries from beatings, malnutrition, and disease. Men who had nightmares about Japanese guards. Men who flinched when they heard Japanese spoken. But the women approached the work with profound dedication, seeking not forgiveness, but simply the chance to do something good, to heal rather than harm. Yuki found herself assigned to work with a veteran named Jack Sullivan, a former corporal who had survived 3 years in Changi prison. He was recovering from malnutrition and tropical diseases, his body slowly rebuilding after years of deprivation. When he learned his nurse was Japanese, his first reaction was visible tension. But as Yuki cared for him with gentle professionalism, checking his vitals, changing his dressings, bringing his meals, the tension gradually eased. One afternoon, through Keiko's translation, Jack asked Yuki why she had volunteered for this work. "Why care for men who were hurt by your people? Isn't it painful?" Yuki considered her answer carefully. "Yes," she said finally. "It is very painful. Every day I see what was done, and I feel shame. But I am nurse. My calling is to heal. I cannot heal the past, but I can try to heal you now. This is all I can offer." Jack absorbed this, his expression complex. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "I thought all Japanese were like the guards in the camp. But you're just a person. A person who's trying to do right." He looked at her directly. "I won't say I forgive what was done, but I can see you're different. That matters. December 8, 1945, marked a significant shift in camp policy. The Australian government announced that Japanese POWs would begin repatriation to Japan in early 1946, as soon as transportation and processing could be arranged. For the women at Cowra, this meant confronting the reality of returning to a devastated homeland where everything they had known was gone. Sergeant Murphy called an assembly on December 15th to explain the timeline and procedures. Repatriation will begin in January, Murphy announced. You'll be given documentation, basic supplies, and passage to Japan. You'll be processed through camps near Tokyo before being released. He paused, his expression softening. I want you to know that you've conducted yourselves with remarkable dignity. You've faced difficult truths with courage. You've worked hard and shown genuine remorse. I respect that tremendously. Several women began crying quietly, overwhelmed by praise from someone they had feared. Yuki raised her hand, her voice steady despite emotion. Sergeant Murphy, will we be allowed to write to you? To tell you how we are doing? Murphy looked surprised but pleased by the question. I don't see why not. Once postal service is established with Japan, write to the camp. I'll make sure letters are forwarded to those of us who served here. The following weeks were spent preparing for departure. The women gathered addresses from guards and medical staff who had become friends. They wrote thank you notes in careful English, expressing gratitude for treatment they never expected to receive. Sergeant Murphy met individually with each woman, offering advice and encouragement for reintegration into a changed Japan. When Yuki's turn came, she found herself struggling to express what his respect had meant to her. No man has ever treated me the way you did, she said finally, the phrase that would become the story's title. In Japan, I was nurse, yes, but still just woman, expected to be silent, obedient, invisible. You treated me like equal, like person who matters. This changed everything. Murphy looked uncomfortable with the profound weight she was giving to basic decency. I just treated you the way people should be treated, the way my mother raised me to treat women, with respect. Yuki shook her head. That is what makes it revolutionary, that you think this is normal, that you were raised to see women as people who deserve dignity. This is not normal for Japanese women. This is gift. January 18th, 1946, brought the day of departure. All 29 women boarded a transport ship bound for Japan, carrying letters of recommendation, certificates acknowledging their hospital work, and personal notes from Australians who had become friends. They would return to a devastated homeland as witnesses to an important truth, that their enemy had been more respectful than their own military, that masculinity could include gentleness and dignity rather than just domination. That transformation was possible even for those who had served a brutal regime. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Yuki stood at the rail, watching Australia recede. Beside her, Hana was crying softly, grieving the loss of something they had found in captivity, but would likely never experience again in Japan. Michiko stood straight and formal, but her eyes were wet. They were returning to a culture where women were expected to be subservient, where questioning authority was dangerous, where the respect they had experienced from Australian men would be an impossible memory. The ship carried them across the Pacific, back to a Japan occupied by American forces, where they would face a long and difficult process of reintegration into a society shattered by war. Yuki found work at a hospital in the ruins of Tokyo, using her skills to care for survivors of the atomic bombs and the firebombing campaigns. She never married, saying later that no Japanese man had ever treated her the way Sergeant Murphy had, and she couldn't accept less than the respect she had learned she deserved. Hana became a teacher, dedicating her life to educating Japanese girls about the importance of self-respect and the right to be treated with dignity. She often told her students about the Australian Guards, who had shown her that men could be protective without being dominating, respectful without expecting subservience. Her lessons were subtle but revolutionary, planting seeds of feminist consciousness in a generation of Japanese women. Michiko worked with the occupation authorities, helping to draft new policies for women's rights in post-war Japan. She used her experience at Cowra as evidence that respect for women wasn't a weakness but a strength, that societies that honoured female dignity were more civilized, not less. Her testimony influenced the new Japanese constitution's provisions for gender equality, though she knew full implementation would take generations. But the story's most remarkable chapter came in September 1975, when Sergeant Murphy, now retired and living in Queensland, organised a reunion at the site of the former Cowra Camp. He had maintained correspondence with several of the women over the decades, and when he proposed a gathering, 19 of the original 29 confirmed they would attend, travelling from across Japan with children and grandchildren born in the decades of peace. They gathered at what had been the women's section of the camp, now a memorial park honouring both Australian POWs who had died in Japanese captivity and the complex history of reconciliation that had followed. Stories were shared in English and Japanese, tears were shed, and yes, there was laughter. Tom, the young corporal who had worked in the garden, attended with his wife and children. Nurse Sarah Mitchell came as well, her long career in military medicine behind her, but her compassion undimmed. The reunion featured a ceremonial moment that moved everyone to tears. The women had collectively commissioned a monument, a stone marker with an inscription in both English and Japanese. Here we learned that respect transcends enmity, that dignity is not weakness, and that how men treat women reveals the true measure of civilization. They unveiled it together, former prisoners and former guards standing side by side as equals. Sergeant Murphy stood to speak, his voice still carrying authority, despite his years. I've been asked many times why we treated you with respect when we had every reason to seek revenge. The answer is simple. Because we wanted to prove that Australian values meant something. That we weren't just words about fairness and decency. We were those things, even when it would have been easier not to be. He looked at the assembled women. But you taught us something too. You taught us that people can change. That confronting hard truths and choosing growth over denial takes real courage. That transformation is possible when people are given the chance. Yuki stepped forward, her English now flawless after 30 years of teaching it to Japanese students. We came to Australia expecting barbarians. We had been taught that Western men were brutal, that surrender meant violation and death. Instead, we found men who treated us with more respect than we had ever known from our own countrymen. Her voice broke slightly. Sergeant Murphy, you changed our understanding of what men could be. You showed us that strength includes gentleness, that masculinity includes respect, that treating women as fully human is not weakness, but the highest form of honour. She raised her glass, and all the Japanese women stood with her. To the Australian soldiers, who saw us as people first and enemies second. To Sergeant Murphy, who treated us with dignity when he could have chosen cruelty. To Keiko, who helped us understand that identity can bridge worlds. To Australia, which proved that how you treat the powerless reveals your true character. You gave us something we never had in Japan. Respect. That gift changed everything. Tom stood, his own glass raised. To the Japanese nurses, who showed us that the enemy is not a monolith, that individuals can transcend their nation's crimes, that healing is possible even across the deepest wounds of war. He looked at Yuki with genuine affection. You were right that day in the garden. We are colleagues, nurses who chose healing over harm. That bond proved stronger than enmity. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through a park built on land where women had once been prisoners but had found something precious. The knowledge that they deserved respect simply for being human. They had proven that even in humanity's darkest hours, when nations taught hatred and dehumanization, simple acts of dignity could shatter those lies and plant seeds of transformation. The Japanese women who expected barbarians but found gentlemen had learned the most important lesson of all, that real strength is choosing respect over domination, that true masculinity includes honoring female dignity, and that treating enemies as humans is the only path to genuine peace. And it all began with words they had never heard from men before. "Ladies, you will be treated with dignity." Those words, and the actions that followed, proved that how we treat the powerless defines who we truly are.